Last class period, we began our journey through the discussion of how we got the Bible. If you remember, we talked about, kind of framed it as how it came from Moses to Missouri. And the first two stages that we talked about last time were writing, and this big word that you might not have heard before coming in this class, and that is canonization. In other words, we talked about how the biblical authors actually wrote the books of the Bible as far as what languages and what they wrote on. And we also emphasize how God was involved in that process. And then in our discussion of canonization, which is stage 2, we talked about first the Old Testament and then the New Testament as far as evidence that we have that supports which books that we have in our Old Testament and our New Testament. So today we come to stage 3 in the process. Now, on the writing and the canonization, after canonization, we have the books collected, right? We have the books of the Old Testament, we have the books of the New Testament. So the question we might ask is, what else is there left to do? And so, in order to answer that, there's actually 2 other things that take place before you can read your Bible that is on your desk. So let's talk about those things. Stage number 3, so stage 1, writing. Stage 2, canonization. Stage 3 is the copying stage. The copying stage. Now, to introduce this stage, I have another concept test for you on the board. It's a question I want us to think about, not the question, the statement I want us to fill in the blank on is, the original manuscripts of the Bible are blank. Okay? So the original manuscripts of the Bible are blank. And by the way, let me clarify what I mean by manuscripts. Manuscripts simply mean the original document, the document that the Apostle Paul wrote, or the document that Moses wrote, or Peter, whoever it is. So what we're saying is that when Paul wrote the letter to Ephesians, where is that original letter that Paul wrote? Okay? We have 4 choices. Again, don't write all 4 of these in your notes. You only write the right one. But what I want to do is I want you to write down the correct one. Okay, so number 1, in the Vatican Museum in Rome. Number 2, in the British Museum in London. Number 3, in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. Or number 4, non-existence. Okay, so the original manuscripts of the Bible are 1, in the Vatican Museum, 2, in the British Museum, 3, in the Israel Museum, or 4, non-existent. Take a minute and write that down, and then we will talk about them. Okay, so here we go. What's your choice? Do you want to see the correct answer? Here it is. The original manuscripts of the Bible are 4, non-existent. What this means is that we have zero, none of the original manuscripts of the biblical text. We don't have Paul's letter to the Ephesians. We definitely don't have Moses writing the book of Moses, Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. We have none of them. All we have, all that we possess, are copies of the original manuscripts. Now, this raises, if you are a good thinker, if you are thinking deeply, this raises an important question, right? Because this raises the question of what in biblical scholarship is referred to as the question of reliability. In other words, are the copies that we today possess accurate reflections of the original manuscript? If you see on the PowerPoint here, I phrase it this way. Can we be confident that the manuscripts we possess accurately reflect the original manuscripts? In other words, does the manuscript we have now reflect does the copy we have now reflect the original? Now, as you think of this, you might be familiar with, you might think of the game that oftentimes is played as a kind of an icebreaker at parties, and that's called the telephone game. If you're familiar with the telephone game, the way that game works is one person basically whispers something into the next person's ear. That person then whispers to the next person. It comes around the room and it gets back to the end. Usually it is extremely laughable. In other words, it might start out as a cow and come back as a crane. It can get crazy, right? And so that's called the telephone game that oftentimes plays at parties. Now, so when we think about that, we think, okay, if the biblical manuscripts have been copied time and time again, so from one copy to another copy to another copy to another copy, then if we think of it in categories of a telephone game, we might be very skeptical that we can trust the copies that we have. Because just like the telephone game, our cow might have turned into a crane, right? And so we want to ask the question, why can we trust, why do we believe that the copies we possess today are reliable representations of the original? And I'm going to wrap this up by coming back to the telephone game again. So, just like in stage 2, when we talked about canonization, in this stage we also have to separate the Old Testament and the New Testament because there are kind of two different pathways. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the Old Testament. So let's talk about how I want to phrase this is I want to give you some key terms to know when it comes to the Old Testament and when it comes to the New Testament. So for the Old Testament, the key characteristic of the copying process for the Old Testament is one word, and that is quality. So if you had to characterize the copying process for the Old Testament books, your number one word that should come out is quality. They were quality control experts, this Jewish scribes who copied the Old Testament. Let me just give you a few examples. They had prescriptions for the scribes who copied the Old Testament, and they had prescriptions related to the type of materials that could be used, the color of ink that was used, the number of columns on a manuscript, spaces between words, and spaces even between books. Now, that was kind of the scribal process, and then when about 500 AD, so this is even 500 years after Jesus, there was a new set of Jewish scribes who came on the scene called the Masoretes. And the Masoretes actually produced the Hebrew text that we currently have that forms the basis for our Hebrew Bibles. And the Masoretes took the quality control and then put it on steroids, because the Masoretes even came and counted the number of times each letter of the alphabet occurred in a biblical book. And they knew the middle letter of the entire Pentateuch, which are the first 5 books of the Bible, and the entire Hebrew Bible. These guys were obsessed with making sure that they were completely accurate. Now, from what we know about Jewish history as far as how they treated manuscripts, we would not and should not expect to ever find any of the original manuscripts of the Old Testament. And here's why. The Jews actually would destroy damaged manuscripts. They would either discard them or destroy damaged manuscripts. They say, what in the world? Why would they do that? Well, because what happens is the manuscript was copied over and over again. Eventually, whatever it was written on, the parchment or the papyrus or whatever, would get worn. And as the manuscript got worn, it oftentimes would get holes or either blurry spots where you couldn't make out a letter. So in other words, sometimes you'll get manuscripts with little holes in them and you don't know what letter is missing. So the Jews did not want a scribe to come along and try to guess what letter belonged there or what that fuzzy letter is there that's gotten worn. So they would discard that manuscript and they would use a more pristine copy for future copying. Now, here's the problem. For the longest time, in fact, the complete Hebrew Bible that we possess today, the earliest complete Hebrew Bible that we possess today dates to 1000 AD. In other words, that's 1,000 years after Jesus. And so for the longest time, we just had to really trust the process. You know, I'm a big Alabama fan, and that's like Nick Saban's favorite quote, trust the process. So we had to trust that the process that the Jewish scribes used to copy Scripture produced a reliable manuscript. Now, all of that changed in 1948, and some of you might have heard about this before. In 1948, there was a little Bedouin shepherd down by the Dead Sea, and he had lost a goat, and he was trying to find his goat, and so he threw a rock up into a cave, and he heard pottery break. And as he got up there, and then later went and brought back some people who knew what they were doing, what they discovered is basically he had discovered the largest biblical manuscript find in history. And it became known as the Dead Sea Scrolls because of its location close to the Dead Sea. Now, there was a community by the Dead Sea in a little place called Qumran that had produced these scrolls. And so they had produced more than just the biblical text. They had many copies of biblical books and stuff like that, but they had many other documents too. So there was more found than just biblical text. But what I want to focus on is the biblical manuscripts they found. They found copies or manuscripts representing every biblical book in every Old Testament book except the book of Esther. And of those finds, the manuscripts that they found dated from the 2nd century BC through the 1st century AD. So what the Dead Sea Scrolls did is it closed the gap by 1,000 years to get us to compare. So now we had a manuscripts 1000 AD, and we had manuscripts that dated before Christ to compare to see how good the copying process was. And here's what we've discovered. That the Dead Sea Scrolls are highly accurate. They represent not the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls show us that the copying process was highly accurate. It wasn't perfect, but it was highly reliable. In fact, Gleason Archer argues that basically, if you look at the book of Isaiah, so at Qumran, they found an Isaiah scroll, the complete book of Isaiah. It's probably the greatest find in Qumran. It had a complete book of Isaiah on one scroll they found. And if you compare the Isaiah scroll that they found at Qumran to the one that we possess that dates 1000 AD, here's what he said. He said, the Isaiah Qumran text is word for word identical with our standard Hebrew manuscript more than 95% of the time. And he says most of the other 5% is minor variants, such as like a spelling variant or a scribal error. So in other words, 1,000-year span and you're batting a 95% rate in copying shows that the Jewish copying process, the quality control did work. Another guy named Miller Murrows, he pointed out that in Isaiah 53, which is a passage that many of us are familiar with, Isaiah 53:6 says, "For we like sheep have gone astray, but the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." He says in that passage there are 166 Hebrew words in Isaiah 53. And out of all those words, there's only 17 letters that are questionable. In other words, that are different between the two manuscripts. So again, what the Dead Sea Scrolls has helped us to see is that the copying process produced a highly reliable manuscripts that we currently possess. Now, again, it's not perfect. But they accord very well with what we found at Qumran. Now, let's talk about the New Testament. As I mentioned when we were talking about kind of canonization, what you have in the spread of early Christianity is not a centralized governing body, but you have multiple churches across the Roman Empire. So what does this look like as far as copying? Well, quality is not our word for the New Testament. So let's think, what is the key, and I have two words here for you, key characteristics of the copying process for the New Testament. And the two words that I would use would be quantity of manuscripts, so we have a bunch of manuscripts, and the date. Quantity and date are our two key words for the New Testament, quantity and date. Now, so here's what we have. Because there was not like a highly centralized governing body in the early church, what you have is very early on, you have various scribes and various people copying New Testament manuscripts. And so you get a mass production of manuscripts, but they're not always done with the quality that we see in the Old Testament manuscripts, which means that you oftentimes get more errors introduced. Now, Bart Ehrman, who I just talked about, who talked about in last lecture, who argues that we can't trust the New Testament, will sometimes make statements like there's 200 and 300,000 different errors in the New Testament manuscripts. And so the question is, what do we do with it? How do we respond? What do we say? Well, let me show you real quick a chart. This chart is dated. This is from Josh McDowell's book, The New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And if you look at this chart, it has a few columns. It has, first of all, a list of basically classical works. And then it has a column of date written with another column followed by the earliest copies and then a time gap and the number of copies. What I want to focus on are the final two columns, the time gap. That is the time gap between when it was originally written and when it was the earliest copy that we possess, okay? And then I also want to focus on the number of copies. So let's look at these. So the first thing, let's think about quantity. If you look at that column, number of copies, you will notice, if you look at it, if you take out Homer's Iliad and then you take out the New Testament, the average would probably be around 20, to be generous. In other words, of all these other ancient classical works, we have about probably an average of 20 copies or 20 manuscripts of those works. Now, if you look up at Homer's Iliad, we have 643 copies. Now again, because this is dated, that's probably a little higher now, but we have 643 copies of Homer's Iliad. And when you compare that to the others, that is very impressive. You would say, wow, we have a lot of manuscripts of the Iliad. But then you gander down and look at the New Testament in the last row, and you notice that he has listed as 5,366 manuscripts, which even blows Homer's Iliad out of the water. In fact, today that number actually is higher than 6,000. In other words, since this chart was produced, that number has increased to over 6,000 manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. Now what that means is, this doesn't mean that every manuscript is a whole book. It means like if we find a fragment of the Gospel of John, that counts as one of the manuscripts. But the point is we have a lot of witnesses to the New Testament. So how does that help? Well, here's how it helps. First of all, to answer the objection that Bart Ehrman throws out that you have 200,000 to 300,000 errors in the New Testament, well, when you're comparing 6,000 different manuscripts, you can see how that number gets high very quickly. And so when you think about the New Testament, think about it in this sense, is that you have a lot of manuscripts to compare. And that is actually a positive thing. In fact, because we have so many manuscripts, there's these scholars called textual critics, who you should say, give thanks to God for every time you pray, because textual critics are the ones who study these manuscripts. They're like uber nerds. They study these manuscripts all the time, and what they've done is they group manuscripts in families, because there are many manuscripts who have these common patterns, and they come from even common regions, and they can group them in families, and they can actually kind of see where an error was introduced into a particular manuscript, and they date the manuscripts, and it's this long process of trying to best reconstruct the original reading of the biblical text. So the advantage, the reason it's a positive that we have so many manuscripts is it gives us so much more data to compare. And here's the crazy thing. Daniel Wallace has argued that if you were to look at all these 6,000 manuscripts, that all of them agree on over 80% of the material. In other words, there's 80% of the material that remains really unaffected by errors, and that is pretty amazing considering the amount of manuscripts that we have. So 6,000 Greek manuscripts. Okay, now let's talk about the time gap. Okay, and so this would be the time between when the book was written and the earliest copy that we have. So again, if you take out the Iliad and you take out the New Testament, you can look through here and you could probably, again, be generous and say the average is probably about 1,000 years. So in other words, that means we know when the original was written, and then 1,000 years later is the earliest manuscript that we possess, a copy that dates to 1,000 years later. That's a big time gap. Now, again, if we look up at Homer's Iliad, we see that the Iliad is much lower. In fact, the Iliad says the time gap is 400 years. So he brings that 1,000 down to 400 years. Now, again, look down at the New Testament. We have a fragment of John's Gospel that dates within 114 years of the writing of John's Gospel. We have entire books of the New Testament that date within 200 years of the original. And we have most of the New Testament dating within 250 years, and the complete New Testament dating within 300, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong column. Apologize. Sorry, guys. We have 50 years. Sorry, the fragment dates to 114, but we have a fragment that dates within 50 years of John's Gospel. We have a book that dates we have books that date within 100 years of the writing. We have most of the New Testament that dates within 150 years, and we have copies of the entire New Testament that date within 225 years of the writing. So you can see again, when it comes to the time gap, the New Testament blows out the other, all these other ancient works. Now, why is the time gap important? The time gap is important because it gives less time for errors to be introduced. In other words, the closer you get to it, the less time you have for more errors to be introduced. So you want a shorter time gap between your original manuscript and the copy. So it's a pretty impressive that we have, like I said, a fragment of John's Gospel that's dating back within 50 years. Now let me kind of summarize this really quick. John Warwick Montgomery has a really good quote. Here's what he says. He says, "To be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity." Let me just kind of put that in modern words. What he in a little more normal language. What he's saying here is he's saying that if the New Testament is not reliable, then you might as well not trust any of those other classical works. And so he's basically saying you just allow all of classical history to go to waste if you will not trust the New Testament. That's how impressive the manuscript evidence is for the New Testament. Another really important thing to see about the New Testament, because again, our manuscripts aren't as clean in the New Testament as they are in the Old Testament. It's important to us to understand that if you look at all of the scribal differences, like where there's 2 copies of a manuscript that are different in the New Testament, no major Christian doctrine is affected by the errors in the New Testament. In other words, there's not a single doctrine that Christians hold that weighs on the balance of whether or not one copy reads correctly and the other reads incorrectly. And so that is comforting to know that most of the errors in the New Testament are minor variations. There are some that are bigger. In other words, if you've the ending of Mark's Gospel, John 8, there's some bigger passages where there's a textual variant that does create some confusion. But for the most part, most of what we see, what are called variants, where 2 manuscripts read differently, most of the variants in the New Testament are very inconsequential for meaning and also for definitely for Christian doctrine. Okay? So we can trust them. We can trust the reliability of the manuscripts. And so that the copying process for both the Old Testament and the New Testament has given us reliable manuscripts. So let me give you one other quote, and then I want to return to our telephone game. So here's Gleason Archer. Here's what he says. "It is safe to say that no documents of ancient times have ever had such a full and impressive witness to the text as is found for the 66 books of the Bible." So let's return to our telephone game. So there is actually, the telephone game actually is not a good analogy for copying of the New Testament. And here's why. Because the telephone game is based on verbal communication. The New Testament is not verbal communication. The New Testament is written communication. Now, let me go one step further. There's actually another game that's actually a takeoff of the telephone game. I don't know the name of it, but I played it, and that is you have a pad of paper, and you sit everybody around a circle, and the first person writes a word. Okay, so we'll just use what we did last time. They write cow. Okay? They pass the pad of paper to the second person. The second person gets the pad of paper, and then they have to not write a word. They have to draw a picture of what the word was. Okay? So they draw their cow. They then pass it to the third person who cannot look at the original word. The third person looks at their picture, right, and has to write a word that represents that picture. So if they're a good artist, they actually might write cow. If they're like me and can't draw anything, they might think it's a horse, okay, and they might write horse. And so then it goes word, picture, word, picture, word, picture, word, picture, all around the circle until it gets back. And just like the telephone game, when the last person reads the word that is on there, you oftentimes get a great laugh. And that's because people can't draw. You see, the variation in that game is not necessarily the word. The variation is in the drawings. The drawings is what throws people off. Now, imagine with me if you had a game like that, but instead of doing word, picture, you wrote word, 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 word all around. In other words, I wrote word cow, the next person copied, the next person copied, the next person copied, the next person copied. Okay? Unless, okay, now, I'll be honest, I have seen some students' handwriting exams that I think would throw that game off, okay? But if everybody's being careful in that game, and there's not a clown like there always is in every game, and everybody really took the time to just write the word that was represented and went around the circle, the chances of getting something really funny at the end and really different are actually pretty low. Why? Because just copying a word around the group is pretty easy, especially if everybody's trying to be careful, okay? So in other words, the variation of the original telephone game was the verbal. The variation on the second version is the picture. But the New Testament actually fits the third thing that I said, and that would be like copying a word around a circle, which would be a very boring game unless somebody started being silly. And so what we have in the New Testament is not the telephone game. It's not the picture variation. It is copying words from one manuscript to another manuscript. And that copying process was not perfect, but it is reliable enough that we can trust that the message communicated in the Scriptures is a message God intended for us to hear. Okay, so we've talked about writing, we've talked about canonization, we've talked about copying. There's still one more phase before you guys can read it. That is, unless you're reading Hebrew and Greek, you need it to be translated into English. So our last stage, stage 4, is translation. And I don't want to focus too much here, but I do want to say that your English translations, okay, if you have a good English translations, okay, a true translation, let me just take a moment and make a distinction here. There is a distinction between a translation and what's called a paraphrase. Now, with translations, you get some different theories on how translations work. You get some people who say, no, you should do word for word, and then others say, no, it should be by phrase or concept level. But a translation is different from a paraphrase. A paraphrase is basically somebody taking a passage of Scripture and really just kind of putting it in their own words and trying to get the big idea. Okay? A good example of a paraphrase would be the Message by Eugene Peterson. Okay? So if you're talking about a translation, the best translations are translations done by a committee. So there's multiple voices and there's debate and wrestling with the text to see the best translation of the text. Okay? So, but your translations are good translations are taken directly from the Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. So for example, the ESV, the NIV, the NAS, the New King James Versions, all these different translations, what the scholars who translate them, what they do is they have their Hebrew and their Greek, whether they're doing Old Testament or New, and they will literally go through and translate it from the Hebrew to the English or the Greek to the English, okay? And so that's important to see because you want to make sure that your translations are based on the Greek and Hebrew. Because if you throw a third language in there, you get even more loss of meaning. Now, so here's what I want to tell you. That your translations are reliable, okay? So you should read the Bible in English. You should soak it in. It is reliable, okay? But here's an important part. That anytime any of you have ever taken a foreign language, you know this, that any time you go from one language to another, there is both interpretation involved And also, you oftentimes lose meaning. Not so that you can't understand it, but oftentimes you can lose connotations, you can lose word order, emphasis, and things like that. So what does that mean? Well, unless you take, the best option is to take Greek and Hebrew, right? If you want to read the Bible in the original language, take Greek and Hebrew. Now, I'm not delusional, and I know that most of you will not take Greek and Hebrew. So what's the next option? This is why comparing translations is so important. Because when you compare translations, you get a sense of where there might be some differences or where interpretation might be coming out more in your translation when you compare it to another. So my encouragement to you is for instance, if you're just doing a daily reading and you're just reading for knowledge of the stories and stuff like we're doing in this class, translations aren't, the differences in the translations aren't as big of a deal. But if you're doing like in-depth Bible study and you're really digging deep and trying to know God's Word deeper, that's where it's going to be really important that you compare translations so that you can see what might possibly be differences and then do deeper research by looking at a commentary, even your study Bible and things like that to see why there might be a difference in the translation, which might then help you better understand what the original meaning of the text would be. So again, I in no ways want to undermine your English translations. Read the Bible in the English. These scholars who translate these translations for us are high caliber scholars who know their Greek and Hebrew inside out. Okay, so you can trust your English translations. But if you're wanting to go deep, I do encourage you to compare translations even more than just two, because oftentimes when scholars are translating, they have to make interpretive decisions because it could go more than one way in the translation. Okay? Now, the last thing I want to remind you of is if you look on your campus web, you will notice something very interesting. You will notice that I have a handout entitled Books of the Bible. Now, why might I have a handout entitled Books of the Bible on campus web? Well, unfortunately, we live in a very biblically illiterate society, even in our churches. And with the advent of technology, especially cell phones, and everybody reading the Bible on their cell phone, many Christians cannot tell you the books of the Bible in order. And so if we truly value the Bible, and if we truly value God's Word to us, then we need to know the books of the Bible. So in this class, you're going to memorize the books of the Bible. But here's the deal. Here's how it's going to work. You're going to memorize it in phases, okay? So you got 3 tests in this class. And so I'll put this on your study guides, but for each test, so the first test you'll memorize, I think, the first 22 books. You'll do Genesis to Song of Songs. And then the second test, you'll write those same books again, but then you're going to add more. And then the third test, you're going to write the same books you wrote in the second test, but you'll add more. Well, actually, you write all 66 on your final exam, okay? So what does that mean for you? Well, here's the deal. I am telling you right now, a test question. A test question is going to be, write the books of the Bible in order, and here's the key, with correct spelling. So what does that mean for you now? Well, here's what it means for you now. You should start ASAP memorizing the books of the Bible if you do not already know them. And here's how you do it. The best way to memorize something, especially like a long list, is through singing. So if you go to YouTube and you just Google books of the Bible songs, I guarantee you can find the genre of music that best fits your personality and your likes. And just begin to sing the books of the Bible and memorize them. And then when you get them memorized by singing, then start writing them, because you need to make sure and check that you are spelling those books correctly for your exams, okay? So again, download the Books of the Bible handout, start learning them, and then each test you're going to write more books, okay? And I will put those on your study guides for your test. All right? Well, thank you.